Right now, 4 astronauts are preparing to travel farther from Earth than any human being has ventured in over 50 years. NASA will tell you this is about science, about exploration, about humanity's next giant leap. And here's the thing, they're not exactly lying. They're just leaving out the part that actually matters. Because buried under the surface of the Moon, in craters so cold they make the surface of Pluto feel like a warm afternoon, is something that could fundamentally rewrite the economics of everything humanity ever does in space. Not rocks, not data, water, not because astronauts need to drink it, but because when you split it apart you get rocket fuel, and rocket fuel, produced on the Moon, changes the entire cost structure of deep space. Artemis II is the first step toward controlling that resource, and you need to understand what happens if America doesn't get there first. If you are new here, welcome. Stay until the end, because the most important space mission in 50 years is not about what they told you it is about. The water is real, the fuel math works, the geopolitical race is already underway, and the deeper you follow the economics, the less this looks like exploration and the more it looks like something humanity has done before, just never off-world. Now, let us get into it. Part 1. This isn't about science. Nobody told you the real reason we're going back to the Moon. And I don't mean that in a conspiratorial way. I mean it in the way that happens when something enormous is hiding in plain sight, wrapped in the kind of language that sounds inspiring enough that nobody stops to ask what's actually underneath it. Science, exploration, humanity's next giant leap. Those words have been said so many times in so many press conferences that they've become wallpaper. You hear them, you feel something vaguely hopeful, and then you move on with your day. Which is exactly how it works. But here's what's actually happening. For the first time in over 50 years, human beings are about to leave Earth orbit. Not astronauts going up to the International Space Station for a 6-month rotation. Not a capsule skimming the upper atmosphere and coming back down. We're talking about 4 people strapping themselves into a spacecraft, lighting the most powerful rocket ever built, and travelling 250,000 miles into deep space. That hasn't happened since December 1972, when Gene Cernan climbed back into the lunar module on the surface of the Moon, took one last look around, and became the last human being to stand on another world. That was over 50 years ago. There are grandparents alive today who were children when that happened. So when NASA says we're going back, the natural assumption is that this is about science, about discovery. Maybe it's a Mars stepping stone. Maybe it's inspiration for the next generation. Those are the stories being told, and they're not entirely wrong, but they're also not the whole picture, and the part that's missing is the part that actually explains why this is happening now, why it's being accelerated with a kind of urgency that the official narrative doesn't quite justify, and why the specific design of this mission only makes sense once you understand what it's really trying to prove. Artemis II doesn't land on the Moon. Let that settle for a moment. The first crewed mission in the Artemis program, the one that will carry humans farther from Earth than any human has travelled since the last Apollo mission, will swing around the Moon and come home. No landing, no moonwalks, no dramatic footage of boots touching lunar dust. From the outside, that looks like a surprisingly modest ambition for a program that's been described as humanity's return to deep space. But the mission design isn't modest, it's calculated. And what it's calculated to prove is the real story here. What NASA rarely says in press conferences, what gets buried in technical briefings and policy documents that most people will never read, is that the entire Artemis program is built around a single resource: water. Specifically, water ice, frozen and preserved in permanently shadowed craters at the lunar South Pole, sitting at temperatures colder than the surface of Pluto, completely untouched, potentially for billions of years. That water isn't interesting because astronauts need to drink it. It's interesting because when you split water molecules apart, you get hydrogen and oxygen. And hydrogen and oxygen, in their liquefied cryogenic forms, are the most efficient rocket propellants we know how to use. The Moon might be sitting on a fuel depot, and whoever figures out how to use it first doesn't just win a science prize. They gain a structural advantage over every space operation that follows for the rest of this century. That's the real mission. Not exploration, not science, infrastructure. The Artemis program is the first serious attempt by any human civilization to build the logistics backbone of an off-world economy. And Artemis II is the single most critical step in that effort, because without proving the hardware works, without proving that human beings can survive the journey and come home safely, nothing that follows is possible. The entire architecture of what comes next depends on this one flight going right. And here's the part that adds a different kind of pressure entirely. The United States is not the only spacefaring nation with its eyes on the lunar South Pole. China has a crewed lunar landing targeted for around 2030. They are not waiting. They are not deferring. And the South Pole, with its permanently shadowed craters full of ice and its narrow ridges of near-constant sunlight that could power a base, doesn't have room for unlimited players to stake infrastructure claims. This isn't a metaphor, this is the geopolitics of the next century being determined right now by who gets there first and who builds something that works. So when Artemis II launches, understand what you're actually watching. You're watching the opening move of a resource play disguised as a science mission. You're watching the first human test of a system that, if it succeeds, puts one nation in a position to shape the economics of deep space for generations. And you're watching it happen under a kind of quiet pressure that nobody in a press conference will quite say out loud. If Artemis II fails, the program doesn't pause. It potentially ends. And with it ends the current best shot at controlling the supply chain of the solar system before someone else does. That's the actual stake sitting underneath all the inspiring language, and it's worth understanding what that means before the rocket leaves the ground. Part 2. The Strange Design of Artemis. 2. Here's the thing about Artemis II that most coverage glosses over. The mission profile, when you actually look at it, is strange. Not in a suspicious way, but in a way that tells you something important about the state of the program and the risks it's managing. The mission follows what's called a free return trajectory. The spacecraft launches, the upper stage fires to push it toward the moon, it swings around the far side using lunar gravity, and the natural arc of the trajectory brings it back to Earth without requiring any additional engine burns to return. It's a geometric safety net. If something goes wrong on the way out, if a system fails, if a problem emerges that can't be fixed, the physics of the orbit will eventually bring the crew home. You don't need to do anything extra to survive. You just have to survive long enough for the trajectory to close. Apollo 13 flew something like this. When that mission's service module oxygen tank exploded, the crew used a free return path as their survival route. It's the same underlying logic being built into Artemis II's mission design from the beginning, which tells you something about how NASA is thinking about this flight. This is not the profile of a program brimming with confidence. It's the profile of a program that knows its hardware is unproven at this scale, that knows a crude failure would be catastrophic, not just for the mission, but for the entire political and public appetite to continue, and that is therefore choosing the most conservative geometry it can justify, while still calling it a deep space mission. Compare this to Apollo 8. In December 1968, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell and Bill Anders didn't just fly around the moon on a free return arc. They burned their engine to enter lunar orbit. They circled the moon 10 times. They read from Genesis on live television with the Earth rising behind them. That was a different kind of confidence, built on a different kind of program momentum. Apollo had political rocket fuel that Artemis doesn't. Artemis II is also the first time the Orion capsule and the Space Launch System will fly together with human beings inside. Artemis I, which flew in 2022, was uncrewed. It tested the trajectory, the systems, the communication, the heat shield. But putting people on board changes everything. Life support has to work. Radiation protection matters in a different way when there are biological systems counting on it. Every redundancy that was academic before becomes personal. The crew will spend roughly 10 days in space, travelling farther from Earth than any human being has travelled since the Apollo era. At their farthest point, they'll be approximately 450,000 kilometers from home. For context, the International Space Station orbits at about 400 kilometers up. That's not even rounding error compared to where Artemis II is going. And at that distance, if something goes catastrophically wrong, there is no rescue mission. There is no crew coming to get you. The free return trajectory is the rescue mission. The heat shield question is particularly interesting, and we'll come back to it in much more detail later. But for now, just understand that re-entry from a lunar return trajectory is significantly more violent than re-entry from low Earth orbit. The spacecraft is coming in faster, the thermal load is higher, and the margins for error are thinner. Artemis I revealed some unexpected ablation behavior in the heat shield that NASA is still working to fully understand and account for. That's not a rumor. That's in the post-mission technical reports. All of this points to a single uncomfortable truth about Artemis II. This is a test flight. A real, crude, high-stakes test flight, which is something we don't often do anymore because the public consequences of failure are enormous. And it's a test flight that the entire lunar water infrastructure strategy, the entire geopolitical positioning argument, the entire vision of an off-world economy depends on passing. One flight. 4 people, 10 days. The gateway to everything that comes next is sitting right there, balanced on a trajectory that was designed to bring them home, even if everything else goes wrong. That's a lot of weight for a mission that the press releases describe as an exciting first step. Part 3. The 50-year gap that shouldn't exist. The hardest part of Artemis II to emotionally process is not the technical risk. It's the fact that this gap exists at all. Think about what happened between December 1972 and right now. Human beings stood on the moon. They drove rovers across it. They hit golf balls on it. They left retro reflectors that scientists still bounce lasers off today. And then, in the span of a few years, we just stopped. Not because we ran out of rockets. Not because the moon turned out to be dangerous in ways we hadn't anticipated. Not because a better destination presented itself. We stopped because the political appetite ran out. The race was won. The cameras moved on. And the extraordinary industrial civilization that had been assembled to get 12 people to another world quietly dissolved. The Saturn V rocket, still the most powerful launch vehicle ever successfully flown, went out of production. The supply chains, the specialized manufacturers, the engineers who knew in their bones how to build engines that could generate millions of pounds of thrust, scattered. Some went to defense contractors, some went to the commercial sector, some retired. The institutional knowledge didn't vanish overnight. It dispersed slowly, over decades, into organizations and individuals and filing cabinets, and eventually into a kind of collective forgetting. And here's the thing that makes this more than just a nostalgic tragedy. Rebuilding deep space capability is not like resuming something you paused. It's more like trying to reconstruct a language from fragmentary texts when most of the native speakers are gone. The blueprints for the Saturn V exist, technically. But the manufacturing processes, the material science decisions, the thousands of small engineering judgments that don't make it into any document because they were just understood by the people doing the work, those are gone. What NASA built with SLS and Orion is not a resurrection of Apollo-era technology. It's a reconstruction, in some cases from first principles, of a capability that should never have been allowed to lapse. The budget numbers tell part of the story. At its peak in the 1960s, NASA was receiving roughly 4.5% of the entire federal budget. That's an almost incomprehensible commitment of national resources. Today, NASA's budget is less than half of 1% of federal spending. The absolute number has grown, but the proportion of national priority has collapsed. And deep space human exploration specifically is the most expensive thing NASA does. It competes with science missions, Earth observation satellites, planetary probes, aeronautics research. Every dollar spent on Artemis is a dollar that could go somewhere else, and that tension is felt constantly. The psychological shift is harder to quantify, but arguably more significant. Apollo-era NASA had a risk tolerance that would be unrecognizable today. The astronauts of that era flew missions that, by modern standards, we would never allow. Not because we don't respect them, but because the public relationship with acceptable risk in human spaceflight has fundamentally changed. A single failure, a single loss of crew, can paralyze a program for years. The Challenger accident in 1986 grounded the shuttle for over 2.5 years. Columbia in 2003 grounded it again for more than 2 years. Every crewed program now exists in the shadow of those events, and all of this matters for the central argument, because the 50-year gap is why Artemis II is as risky as it is. If deep space human flight capability had been maintained, even at a reduced level, the first crewed Artemis mission wouldn't feel like a civilizational test. It would feel like routine progression. Instead, because we let the capability decay almost entirely, we are now in a position where the first crewed mission in half a century is simultaneously a hardware validation, a geopolitical statement, and the single gate that either opens or closes the door on a lunar infrastructure strategy that the entire future of space resource development depends on. The gap shouldn't exist, but it does, and its consequences are sitting right at the center of what Artemis II is trying to do. Part 4. The real stakes. Nobody says out loud. There is a pattern in the history of American space programs that almost nobody in the public conversation wants to talk about directly, probably because it's uncomfortable and probably because admitting it out loud feels like inviting it to happen again. Space programs in the United States do not survive political transitions well. Apollo ended not because the mission stopped working, but because the administration that followed couldn't justify the cost against other competing priorities. The Constellation program, which was the early 2000s attempt to go back to the moon, was cancelled in 2010 after years of development and billions of dollars spent. The program that preceded that and the one before that followed similar arcs, announced with fanfare, funded for a cycle or two, then quietly defunded when the political wind shifted. Artemis has survived longer than most, but it's worth being honest about why. It survived partly because of design choices that were explicitly made to make it politically difficult to cancel. International partnerships with Canada, Japan, the European Space Agency, Australia, and others create diplomatic costs to cancellation that didn't exist for purely domestic programs. Congressional districts across the country have aerospace jobs tied to SLS and Orion components, creating a distributed political constituency that makes the program harder to shut down. This is not accidental. It's a deliberate strategy borrowed from how the International Space Station survived budget battles for decades. But strategies can fail, and the specific risk with Artemis is that its cost structure is so extreme, we'll get to the numbers in detail later, that it creates its own political vulnerability. When a single launch costs more than $4 billion by some estimates, every mission becomes a political event that either justifies the program or hands its critics exactly the argument they need. Artemis II is the inflection point. A successful mission doesn't guarantee the program's survival, but it makes cancellation significantly harder. A failure doesn't automatically end it, but it creates the conditions under which the political will to continue could collapse faster than any engineering timeline. And the lunar water infrastructure argument, the resource play, the geopolitical positioning, none of it matters if the program ends before the infrastructure gets built. Artemis II is not just a test flight. It's the moment the program either becomes too real to stop or too costly to justify continuing. Part 5. The first reveal. Let me say something that will reframe everything that follows. We're not going back to the moon to explore it. We're going back to the moon to use it. That single shift in framing changes the entire logic of the Artemis program. Exploration means science, discovery, flags, prestige, and inspiration. Use means something different. Use means infrastructure, supply chains, industrial processes, resource extraction. It means treating the moon not as a destination but as a location on a map of a larger system, a waypoint, a depot, a foundational node in something that eventually looks less like a science program and more like a logistics network. This is not the framing that shows up in the public-facing materials, And the reason it doesn't is partly legitimate. The program is still in its early stages. Talking about lunar resource extraction sounds either premature or unsettling, depending on your perspective. There's a version of that conversation that makes NASA sound like a mining company, rather than an exploration agency, which is a PR problem in a country that still largely understands space in terms of Apollo mythology. But the technical and economic logic is unambiguous to anyone who looks at it clearly. Water ice at the lunar South Pole, if it exists in accessible concentrations, is not a geological curiosity. It is a feedstock. When you split a water molecule, you get 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. Scale that up, cool it down, store it cryogenically, and you have liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, the same propellants that powered the space shuttle's main engines, some of the most efficient rocket propellants ever used. Produced on the Moon, they don't have to be launched from Earth, and that changes the cost structure of everything. Think about it this way. Getting anything off the surface of the Earth and into orbit costs somewhere between a few thousand and several $1,000s per kilogram, depending on the launch system. Getting it to the Moon costs significantly more. Every kilogram of propellant that a spacecraft needs to carry from Earth to complete a deep space mission has to be paid for at those rates, and propellant isn't a small fraction of a mission's mass. The rocket equation is brutal. To get anywhere interesting, you have to carry enormous amounts of fuel, but carrying that fuel makes you heavier, which means you need more fuel to carry the fuel, which makes you heavier again. It compounds. Earth is at the bottom of a gravity well so deep that escaping it is the most expensive part of almost everything we do in space. Now imagine a fuel depot that isn't at the bottom of that well. The Moon's gravity is about 1/6 of Earth's. Getting off the lunar surface requires a fraction of the energy required to get off Earth. If you can mine water ice at the South Pole, process it into propellant, and store it at a cislunar depot, then spacecraft don't have to carry their return fuel from Earth. They top up at the Moon. That's not just convenient, that's a fundamental restructuring of the economics of deep space travel. It's the difference between every mission being a massive, expensive one-time event and missions becoming something that functions more like a transportation system. The Moon isn't the destination in this vision. The Moon is the gas station, and the South Pole is where the gas is buried. That's what Artemis II is ultimately the first step toward proving is possible. Not science, not flags, the supply chain of the solar system. Part 6. The coldest places in the solar system. There are places on the Moon where sunlight has not reached in billions of years. Not shadowed in the way a room gets shadowed when you turn off the light. Permanently, irreversibly, cosmically shadowed. The Moon's axial tilt is only about 1.5 degrees, compared to Earth's 23.5 degrees. That almost perfectly upright orientation means that at the poles, the sun never rises more than a few degrees above the horizon. And in the deep floors of certain craters at the South Pole, craters whose rims are high enough to block even that sliver of sunlight, no photon has hit the surface since those craters formed. Some of them formed billions of years ago, before complex life existed on Earth, before the continents arranged themselves into anything you'd recognize on a map. The temperature at the bottom of those craters drops to around -230 degrees Celsius. That's colder than the surface of Pluto. And in that deep freeze, completely undisturbed, volatile compounds, including water ice, have been preserved in a kind of cosmic deep freeze since they were deposited there by billions of years of asteroid impacts, comet bombardments, and possibly by reactions in the lunar soil itself. Scientists have suspected lunar polar water ice for decades, but the confirmation came in pieces. The Chandrayaan-1 mission, launched by the Indian Space Research Organisation in 2008, carried an instrument that used radar to probe the subsurface near the poles. The reflectivity signatures it detected were consistent with water ice. Then, in 2009, NASA deliberately crashed a rocket stage into a permanently shadowed crater called Cabeus near the South Pole. The LCROSS mission, which stands for Lunar Crater Observation and Sensing Satellite, watched the plume of material thrown up by the impact with a trailing spacecraft. The spectrometers confirmed it. Water. Not just a hint. Water, along with other volatiles coming up from the crater floor. The challenge is that we still don't know exactly how much there is or how accessible it is. Orbital data gives us broad indications of hydrogen abundance, which we interpret as a proxy for ice, but it doesn't tell us whether the ice is in thick, miniable deposits or distributed in thin layers mixed with regolith at concentrations that would make extraction impractical. The distribution is patchy and uncertain. What we know is that the resource exists. What we don't know is whether it exists in a form that can be economically exploited at the scale required to actually fuel a space economy. The terrain around the permanently shadowed regions adds another layer of difficulty. These aren't smooth, flat craters. The South Pole is ancient, heavily cratered terrain. The shadows that make ice preservation possible are created by steep crater walls and jagged topography that makes navigation and operation extremely challenging. Sending a rover into a permanently shadowed region means operating in complete darkness, at temperatures that challenge everything from electronics to lubricants, with communication that can be difficult because of the surrounding terrain. The resource is there. Getting to it is a different kind of problem entirely. But here's the thing that makes all of that difficulty worth thinking about. The lunar South Pole isn't just where the ice is. It's also one of the few places near the poles where so-called peaks of eternal light exist. Ridges and mountain tops that are illuminated by the sun almost continuously because of that near-zero axial tilt, receiving sunlight for up to 90% or more of the lunar cycle. Ice in the shadows, solar power on the ridges, they're practically neighbours in some locations. The very geography that preserves the resource also happens to be close to the geography that could power its extraction. That is not an accident of presentation. That is the specific combination of conditions that makes the lunar South Pole, and only the lunar South Pole, the target of every serious long-duration lunar mission being planned right now by every spacefaring nation. Which brings us directly back to why Artemis II matters, and why the clock on all of this is already running. Part 7. Why water is more valuable than gold. Water is not valuable in space because people need to drink it. That framing is technically true, but almost completely misses the point. Yes, human beings need water to survive. Yes, producing water on the moon rather than launching it from Earth has practical value for life support. But if that were the whole story, lunar water would be an interesting logistical detail, not a geopolitical inflection point. The reason lunar water is being treated as a strategic resource at the level of national competition isn't hydration. It's propulsion. Water is H2O. Two hydrogen atoms bonded to one oxygen atom. When you run electrical current through water in a process called electrolysis, those bonds break. You get hydrogen gas and oxygen gas as separate products. Now take those two gases, cool them to cryogenic temperatures where they become liquid, store them, and you have liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. These are not exotic materials. These are the same propellants that powered the main engines of the space shuttle. They are among the most energetically efficient chemical propellants that physics allows. The specific impulse, which is the measure of how efficiently a rocket engine uses propellant, of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen combustion is higher than almost any other chemical combination available. So here is the cascade of logic that makes lunar water potentially more strategically valuable than any mineral or metal you could find anywhere in the solar system. Every space mission that goes anywhere significant needs propellant. Propellant is the majority of a rocket's mass at launch. Getting propellant off Earth is extraordinarily expensive because of the gravity well problem. But if you can produce propellant on the moon, from water ice that's already there, you've removed the most expensive component of deep space missions from the Earth launch manifest entirely. Let's put a number on the Earth launch cost to make it concrete. Even with the most cost-efficient rockets currently flying, getting a kilogram of payload to low Earth orbit costs somewhere in the range of $2,000 to several $1,000s. Getting to the moon multiplies that cost substantially. A Mars mission using conventional Earth-launched propellant architecture requires launching hundreds of tons of propellant into space. The economics are staggering, and they currently make everything beyond Earth orbit prohibitively expensive at any real scale. That's not a temporary technical limitation, That's a fundamental constraint imposed by where we're launching from. Now run the alternative scenario. A functioning lunar fuel production facility extracts water ice, electrolyzes it, liquefies the products, and stores them at a cislunar depot. Spacecraft going to Mars, to the asteroid belt, to Jupiter's moons, stop at the depot on their way out. They don't carry their full propellant load from Earth. They top up at the moon. The mass they don't have to launch from Earth translates directly into cost savings that could be enormous. We're talking about potentially changing the unit economics of deep space by an order of magnitude. This is why the phrase lunar water equals strategic control is not hyperbole. Whoever establishes a working propellant production facility at the lunar South Pole doesn't just have a useful capability, they have a structural position in the logistics network of all future deep space activity. Every mission that depends on lunar propellant passes through that node. That's not a science asset. That's infrastructure with economic and geopolitical implications that extend far beyond the moon itself. And Artemis II, with its quiet validation of the systems needed to get humans to and from deep space safely, is the essential first step toward making any of that real. The water matters because of the propellant. The propellant matters because of the economics, and the economics are exactly what's at stake when that rocket leaves the ground. Part 8. The gravity well problem. Imagine standing at the bottom of a very deep hole with very steep walls. Everything you want to do that matters is outside the hole. Getting yourself out of the hole is expensive, difficult, and dominates the budget of everything you want to accomplish. Now imagine that there's a much shallower hole just next door, and from that shallower hole you can reach most of the same destinations with a fraction of the effort. That's the difference between launching from Earth and launching from the moon. Earth's gravity is not just strong, it's expensive in a very specific engineering sense. The escape velocity from Earth's surface is about 11.2 kilometers per second. That's the speed you need to reach to break free from Earth's gravitational pull entirely. Reaching low Earth orbit requires getting to about 7.8 kilometers per second. These numbers translate directly into propellant requirements, which translate into rocket mass, which translates into cost. The math is merciless. Every additional kilogram of mass that a rocket has to lift compounds the amount of propellant needed, because you're not just lifting the payload, you're lifting the fuel needed to lift the payload, and the fuel needed to lift the fuel needed to lift the payload. This is the tyranny of the rocket equation, and it has defined the economics of spaceflight since the first days of the space age. The moon's surface gravity is roughly 1/6 of Earth's. Its escape velocity is about 2.4 kilometers per second, compared to Earth's 11.2. Reaching orbit from the lunar surface is almost trivially easy by comparison. This isn't just an interesting physics fact. It's the geometric foundation of the entire argument for a lunar fuel economy. If you produce propellant on the moon and store it in cislunar space, either on the lunar surface itself or at a depot in orbit around the moon, you have essentially created a logistics node that can supply missions without paying the enormous energy tax of climbing out of Earth's gravity well. Missions departing from Earth still have to reach cislunar space, but their propellant requirements for everything that happens beyond that point could be sourced from the moon rather than launched from Earth. The savings compound over many missions. At scale, the difference is transformative. This is why the moon is not a destination in the long-term vision. It's a node, a transfer point, a place where the deep space economy supply chain connects to the resources that make everything beyond Earth orbit financially possible. And the specific reason Artemis II matters in this context is that it validates the human presence side of the equation. Robots can mine, robots can process. But the early stages of building lunar infrastructure, the site selection, the construction, the complex problem-solving that invariably accompanies deploying systems in a new environment, these will require people. And getting people there and back safely is exactly what Artemis II is designed to prove is possible. The gravity well is the fundamental problem of space. Lunar water is the most plausible near-term answer to that problem, and the entire geopolitical urgency around the South Pole exists because control of that answer translates directly into control of the cislunar logistics network that everything else depends on. Part 9. The gas station in space concept. Here is where we need to be honest about the gap between the vision and the current reality. The concept of a lunar fuel depot, a cislunar gas station that takes the place of Earth-launched propellant for deep space missions, is compelling, logical, economically sensible, and as of right now, completely unproven at any operational scale. None of the individual technologies required have been demonstrated in a complete integrated system on the lunar surface. This is important to say clearly, because the strategic urgency around lunar water doesn't come from a working system. It comes from the recognition that whoever builds a working system first gains an enormous and potentially permanent advantage. The race is to get there before the technology is proven, because the prize is the first mover position. So what would it actually take? In the most simplified terms, you need several connected capabilities. First, extraction. You need to get the ice out of the permanently shadowed crater floor, which means operating in complete darkness at temperatures approaching negative 230 degrees Celsius, using equipment that can survive those conditions and dig into material whose properties we haven't fully characterized at scale. Second, processing. You need to run electrolysis on the extracted water to separate hydrogen and oxygen, using power that, in the shadowed regions, can't come from solar panels. Some combination of nuclear power and energy transported from nearby sunlit ridges is the likely answer, but neither has been deployed on the lunar surface. Third, liquefaction and storage. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen have to be maintained at cryogenic temperatures indefinitely. Cryogenic storage in the lunar environment, with its temperature extremes and radiation exposure, is a significant engineering challenge that hasn't been solved at scale. Fourth, transfer. Propellant stored on the moon has to get to spacecraft. That means either a surface-to-orbit transfer system or depots in lunar orbit that receive propellant from the surface and dispense it to passing spacecraft. Every one of those steps represents a genuine unsolved engineering problem at the required scale. Small-scale demonstrations are beginning. The Perseverance rover on Mars has already demonstrated oxygen production from the Martian atmosphere using an instrument called MOXIE, which is a proof of concept for in situ resource utilization. NASA and other agencies are developing robotic missions to the lunar South Pole that will test ice extraction approaches. But there is a long distance between a laboratory demonstration and a functioning industrial supply chain on another world. None of this undermines the strategic argument. If anything, it reinforces the urgency. If this capability is going to exist in the time frame that matters, which is the next 20 to 40 years, the groundwork has to start now. Artemis II doesn't build the gas station, but it validates the human spaceflight system that will eventually have to oversee and maintain whatever gets built there. The gas station concept isn't science fiction, but it's also not yet reality, and the distance between those two states is exactly what the next decade of space activity is trying to close. Part 10. The second reveal. Here is the cleanest statement of what all of this means when you put it together. Lunar water is not just a resource. It is a choke point. Whoever controls the infrastructure to extract, process, and distribute lunar propellant controls the most important logistics node in the inner solar system for the next century. Not just for moon missions, for everything. Mars missions, asteroid mining, deep space science, commercial operations in cislunar space. All of it flows through the propellant supply chain, and the most accessible location to build that supply chain from is the lunar South Pole. This is not a metaphor. It's the same structural logic that has governed economic power throughout human history. Control of maritime choke points defined which empires grew wealthy in the age of sail. Control of oil infrastructure defined which nations had disproportionate influence over the industrial economy. The mechanism is always the same. Identify the resource that everything else depends on, establish the infrastructure to control its flow, and you gain leverage over every activity downstream. In space, the resource is propellant. The choke point is the lunar South Pole, and the infrastructure race to establish that position is already underway, even though no one has yet built anything that functions at operational scale. What makes the race interesting and genuinely uncertain is that the advantage goes not to the country that announces the best plan. It goes to whoever builds a working system first and establishes physical presence that is practically difficult to displace. There's an asymmetry in this race that deserves acknowledgement. Early movers don't just win the specific asset, they gain compounding advantage. Infrastructure already in place makes subsequent missions cheaper, which funds more infrastructure, which attracts more investment, which accelerates the next phase of development. First mover advantage in space infrastructure isn't just a one-time prize, it's a compounding position that gets harder to overcome the longer it's held. This is the actual logic of Artemis, not inspiration, not science, not even prestige. It's the recognition that the window for establishing a dominant position in cislunar space infrastructure is narrow, that the competition for that position is already active, and that everything depends on validating the human deep space system before the window closes. Artemis II is the gate. Everything else, the depots, the processing plants, the propellant distribution network, the permanent presence, is on the other side of it. Part 11. The other program nobody talks about enough. While most Americans were focused on what NASA was building, another program was quietly doing something that deserved significantly more attention. China's lunar program has followed a trajectory that, when you step back and look at it as a sequence, is methodical in a way that suggests a very specific long-term goal. The Chang'e program has executed a series of missions that started with orbital reconnaissance, progressed through soft landings, and has achieved things that no other space agency has done. In January 2019, Chang'e 4 became the first spacecraft in history to successfully land on the far side of the Moon, a feat that required a dedicated relay satellite in a special orbit just to maintain communication, because the Moon's bulk blocks direct line of sight to Earth from the far side. That's not just a milestone, it's a demonstration of the kind of complex multi-element mission architecture that lunar infrastructure development requires. In 2020, Chang'e 5 returned samples from the Moon to Earth, the first lunar sample return mission since the Soviet Lunar 24 in 1976. Again, not a coincidence, a demonstration. They can land, operate, collect, launch from the lunar surface, navigate home, and recover the samples. That's the complete loop of a crewed mission, demonstrated robotically. The engineering capability implied by that demonstration is significant. Looking forward, China has publicly stated its intention to land taikonauts, that's Chinese astronauts, on the Moon around 2030. They are developing the Long March 10 rocket and a crewed lunar spacecraft. They have announced the International Lunar Research Station project in collaboration with Russia, which is framed explicitly as a long-term permanent infrastructure initiative, not a series of short-duration visits. The framing is specifically about sustained presence, about staying. The comparison to Artemis's iteration delays is unavoidable and uncomfortable. Artemis has faced schedule slips across nearly every major milestone. The original Artemis III crewed landing, which was supposed to happen in 2024, has been pushed back multiple times. The Space Launch System has faced repeated delays and cost overruns. Commercial lunar lander development has encountered setbacks. Meanwhile, China's program has executed on its stated milestones with a consistency that suggests an institutional commitment to the schedule that doesn't bend easily to budget pressures or political transitions. This isn't a story about which country has better engineers. It's a story about which program has more insulation from the kind of political and budgetary disruption that has historically killed American long-duration space initiatives. And the reason that matters is because the lunar South Pole resource play doesn't reward the most ambitious plan. It rewards whoever gets there and builds something that works. The timeline of that race is directly connected to why Artemis II is being framed with the urgency it is, even when the mission itself looks conservative. The conservative design of Artemis II is a recognition that the program can't afford a failure, The urgency of the overall Artemis timeline is a recognition that someone else is on the clock too. Part 12. Two Systems, Two Futures. Here is a legal detail that turns out to have enormous practical consequences. No country owns the moon. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and most other spacefaring nations, prohibits national sovereignty over celestial bodies. You cannot plant a flag and legally claim the moon. But the treaty says nothing specific about resource extraction. Whether a nation or a company can mine the moon and own what they extract is a genuinely unsettled question in international law. The United States has attempted to address this through the Artemis Accords, a framework of bilateral agreements that NASA has negotiated with partner nations. As of the mid-2020s, over 40 nations have signed. The Accords include provisions about transparency of operations, interoperability of systems, safe zones around active operations, and the concept of resource extraction rights. They're not a formal international treaty with binding enforcement mechanisms. They're more like a set of shared operating principles among countries that agree to align with the American approach. China and Russia have not signed the Artemis Accords. They're developing their own framework for lunar governance through the International Lunar Research Station project and through engagements at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. The governance philosophies underlying the two frameworks are genuinely different. The American-aligned approach tends toward an open access model, where commercial extraction is permissible under transparency rules. The Chinese and Russian approach emphasizes international coordination and is less explicit about commercial resource rights. The practical implication is that two parallel and legally distinct operating frameworks are developing for lunar activity, and they are not converging. If both the Artemis program and the China-Russia lunar station achieve operational capability in the 2030s, you will have two active lunar presences operating under different rules, on a body where the most valuable resources are concentrated in a specific geographically limited area. The South Pole isn't a continent. The permanently shadowed craters with accessible ice, combined with adjacent sunlit ridges for power, represent a relatively small number of genuinely optimal sites. Everyone wants roughly the same real estate. There's no agreed mechanism to resolve competing claims to those sites. The Moon Treaty of 1979, which would have established lunar resources as the common heritage of mankind subject to international management, was never ratified by any major spacefaring nation. So what you're left with is a situation where physical presence and demonstrated capability may end up functioning as de facto territorial logic, not because anyone formally claims territory, but because whoever builds infrastructure somewhere first makes it practically difficult for anyone else to build competing infrastructure in the same location. Which is exactly why the timing question around Artemis II connects directly to the geopolitical competition question. Getting there first isn't just about prestige. In the absence of effective legal frameworks, it might be the only mechanism that actually determines who gets what. Part 13. Why the South Pole is already claimed without being claimed. There's a geographic concept that only makes sense when you understand the Moon's specific geometry, and once you understand it, the South Pole competition clicks into focus in a way that nothing else fully explains. The Moon's near zero axial tilt creates a very specific condition near the poles. At most latitudes on the Moon, you experience 2 weeks of daylight followed by 2 weeks of complete darkness in a cycle tied to the lunar day, which is about 29.5 Earth days long. Operating through the 2-week lunar night requires either enormous battery capacity or a nuclear power source, because solar panels are useless when there's no sunlight for 2 weeks straight. That's a significant constraint on mission design and duration. But at the poles, because the sun skims along the horizon rather than rising and setting in a normal cycle, certain elevated terrain features, mountain peaks and crater rims that stick up above the surrounding landscape, receive near-continuous sunlight. These are called peaks of eternal light, and they are extraordinary. In some cases, specific ridge sections at the South Pole receive sunlight for upwards of 80 to 90% of the year, with brief interruptions as the geometry shifts slightly. That's effectively continuous solar power, and these peaks of near-continuous illumination are sometimes just a few kilometres or tens of kilometres away from the permanently shadowed craters that contain ice. You can almost see the architecture it suggests. A base on an illuminated ridge for power, pipelines or transport systems extending down into the shadowed craters for resource extraction. The two essential ingredients for a self-sustaining operation are sitting next to each other. Nowhere else on the Moon offers this combination. Equatorial regions have more consistent terrain and better communication geometry with Earth, but 2 weeks of darkness is operationally brutal. The South Pole's specific geography is uniquely suited to sustained long-duration operations. The problem is that these optimal sites are limited. There aren't dozens of perfect peaks of near-continuous illumination adjacent to ice-rich, permanently shadowed craters. There are a relatively small number of them, and they are already being mapped and evaluated by every space agency that has serious lunar ambitions. Some landing sites have been specifically designated in mission planning documents not just for their scientific value, but for their proximity to these dual advantage geographic features. There is no formal process by which any nation is claiming these sites, but the logic of first presence advantage is quietly replacing formal legal frameworks in practice. The first entity to land, establish operations and build infrastructure at one of these optimal sites creates a practical reality that subsequent actors have to navigate around. Not by law, by physics. If you've built a processing facility on the best ridge adjacent to the best ice deposit, there isn't a second best option nearby that's nearly as good. You don't have to own the territory to have effectively controlled the resource. You just have to be there first and build something that works. Artemis is trying to be that first presence, so is China. And both programs understand, even if neither says it in these exact words, that whoever gets to the optimal sites first may be determining something that lasts much longer than any individual mission. Part 14. The timeline pressure. Nobody admits. Here is a tension that lives in the gap between what engineers think about and what politicians say at press conferences. Engineering timelines for something as complex as a crewed lunar landing are measured in years and driven by technical challenges, testing requirements, manufacturing capacity, and the irreducible complexity of building systems that have to work perfectly when human lives depend on them. Political timelines are driven by election cycles, budget negotiations, and the attention span of a public that has many other things competing for it. These two clocks do not run at the same speed, and the Artemis program exists at their uncomfortable intersection. The specific pressure around China's 2030 crewed lunar landing target creates a third clock. If China lands on the Moon, and if their first landing is anywhere near the South Pole, and if the United States hasn't yet established a credible presence in the region with its own crewed missions, the narrative shift would be enormous. Not just in terms of prestige, but in terms of the practical positioning argument we've been building throughout this entire discussion. Early presence shapes subsequent options, and the window in which Artemis can be the first sustained crewed presence at the South Pole is not indefinitely open. This creates pressure to accelerate the Artemis timeline beyond what engineering comfort might prefer. And that tension is visible, if you know where to look, in decisions about mission readiness, about acceptable risk levels, about the specific design conservatism of Artemis II. It's a mission that is being as careful as it can be, while also being as fast as it can be, and those two imperatives are not always comfortable neighbours. The entire program is a high-stakes negotiation between the speed that geopolitical competition demands and the caution that engineering rigour requires, and Artemis II is where that negotiation produces its first crewed result. Part 15. The third reveal. Let's name what this actually is. This is not Space Race 2.0. The original Space Race was fundamentally about prestige and ideological competition. Who gets there first demonstrates whose system, capitalism or communism, whose science, whose engineers, whose national will is superior. Flags and footprints. The symbolic value was the primary value. What is happening now is different in kind, not just degree. This is an infrastructure race. and infrastructure races operate by a different logic than prestige races. In a prestige race, a late second-place finish still gets you on the podium. In an infrastructure race, the first mover builds the node, and every subsequent player has to either integrate with that node or build a competing one at enormous cost. The advantage compounds in a way that prestige advantages don't. Think about railroads. The railroads that got built in the American West in the second half of the 19th century didn't just connect cities, they defined which cities grew and which didn't. Towns that got bypassed by the railroad route, sometimes by just a few miles, often didn't survive. The routing decision became a structural fact about economic geography that persisted for generations. Nobody in 1870 was thinking about the 2020 economy when they were laying track in Wyoming. But the infrastructure decisions made then created path dependencies that shaped everything that followed. Lunar infrastructure is the same kind of compounding commitment. A cislunar propellant depot, once it exists and once missions start depending on it, becomes structurally embedded in the economics of deep space activity. The nations and commercial entities that aligned their operations with that depot gain advantages over those that didn't. Alternative systems become expensive to build from scratch when existing systems already have operational history and supply chain depth. The first depot isn't just a facility. It's the seed of a gravitational field that pulls subsequent development toward it. This matters enormously for how we think about Mars. Mars is the destination that drives a significant portion of the long-term political imagination around space. An accrued Mars mission, by current best estimates, requires an enormous amount of propellant. If that propellant can be sourced in part from lunar production, the economics of Mars change. If it cannot because no operational lunar fuel infrastructure exists, then Mars missions look the way they look today. Theoretically possible, practically unaffordable at the frequency and scale that would make a sustained Mars presence viable. The Moon's infrastructure is not just the Moon story. It's the Mars story too. It's the asteroid belt story. It's the cislunar economy story. Artemis II is the first operational test of the system that has to work before any of that can be real. Not a simulation, not a design study. An actual human crew, on actual hardware, going to actual deep space and proving that the system closes, that it works, that the gap in deep space human capability can be closed. Because if it can't, the infrastructure race doesn't have an American competitor, and the question of who controls the logistics network of the inner solar system has only one candidate left in it. Part 16. Artemis II is a test, but not just a test. Let's walk through what actually happens during the 10 days of Artemis II, because the mission sequence tells you something important about what the program is trying to prove and what risks it knows it's carrying. The Space Launch System, which stands roughly 111 meters tall, about the height of a 36-story building, lights its engines on the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center. The core stage engines and solid rocket boosters generate about 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. The vehicle climbs through the atmosphere, the boosters separate, the core stage separates, and the interim cryogenic propulsion stage fires to push the Orion capsule and its 4 crew members onto a translunar trajectory. This all happens in roughly the first 2 hours after launch. The crew then spends several days in transit to the Moon, covering roughly 380,000 kilometers. During this time, the life support systems are running continuously. Carbon dioxide scrubbing, water recycling, thermal management in an environment where one side of the spacecraft faces the sun and the other faces the absolute zero of deep space. Communication with Earth operates with the speed of light delay that increases as distance grows, reaching a round-trip delay of about 2.5 seconds at lunar distance. Not catastrophic, but enough to mean that real-time problem-solving from the ground is slower and more complex than during a low Earth orbit mission. The crew also experiences radiation exposure that simply doesn't happen in low Earth orbit. The International Space Station sits within Earth's magnetosphere, which deflects a significant fraction of galactic cosmic rays and solar energetic particles. The Moon is not. Artemis II will be the first mission in the modern era to carry humans through the full radiation environment of cislunar space for an extended duration, with modern instruments measuring exactly what that exposure looks like. That data will directly inform crew health planning for every subsequent deep space mission. At the Moon, the spacecraft swings around the far side, temporarily losing all communication with Earth as the Moon's bulk blocks the signal. This communication blackout lasts roughly 20 to 30 minutes. It's a period during which the crew operates completely autonomously, relying on pre-planned procedures, their own judgment, and the inherent stability of the free return trajectory. Then they emerge on the other side, re-establish communication, and begin the return trip. Re-entry happens at roughly 11 kilometers per second, compared to the roughly 8 kilometers per second of an International Space Station return. That extra 3 kilometers per second doesn't sound like much, but kinetic energy scales with the square of velocity, which means the thermal load during re-entry is significantly higher. The heat shield has to absorb and dissipate that energy without catastrophic failure, and then 4 people land in the Pacific Ocean, and if everything has worked, the proof has been delivered. Success on Artemis II means the system is real. It means humans can leave Earth orbit, survive the journey, and come home. That's not a small thing. That's the validation that the entire lunar infrastructure argument has been waiting for. The resources at the South Pole, the geopolitical race is running, but none of it matters if the human spaceflight system itself can't be proven to work. Artemis II is the proof. Part 17. The Heat Shield Problem. There is a detail from the Artemis I mission that deserves more public attention than it received. When the uncrewed Orion capsule returned from its lunar flyby in December 2022, post-mission analysis of the heat shield revealed ablation patterns that didn't quite match what the models had predicted. The heat shield material, called Avcoat, is designed to ablate, meaning it deliberately burns away and takes heat energy with it during re-entry. That's the plan. But the way it ablated wasn't uniform. There were localized regions of more significant material loss than the thermal models had anticipated. This is not a minor housekeeping issue. The heat shield is a single point of failure system. There is no backup. If the heat shield performs inadequately during re-entry, the capsule doesn't just malfunction, it burns up, with 4 people inside. NASA launched a formal investigation to understand the cause and to determine whether the behavior observed on Artemis represents a problem that could affect a crewed mission. The investigation has involved detailed analysis of material samples, review of test data, and development of modified re-entry approaches that might reduce the thermal stress on the shield. The physics of why this matters starts with velocity. Returning from the Moon means arriving at Earth at about 11 kilometers per second. That's roughly 40,000 kilometers per hour. At that speed, the air in front of the spacecraft can't move out of the way fast enough, and it compresses and heats enormously. Peak heat flux during lunar return re-entry can reach values that would melt or vaporize most structural materials in seconds. The heat shield is the only thing standing between the crew and that environment. The specific concern with Artemis II is this. The crewed mission is not just repeating the Artemis I profile. Small changes in trajectory, mass distribution, and atmospheric entry angle can change the heat flux distribution in ways that matter. Understanding the ablation behavior well enough to confidently predict how the shield will perform on a crewed flight is the core of the problem NASA has been working on since the Artemis I analysis. NASA has indicated that they have developed a revised re-entry approach for Artemis II that distributes the heat load differently. But there remains some public uncertainty about the degree of confidence in that solution, and the nature of technical honesty in a high-stakes program means that certainty is not something that can be fully delivered in advance. What can be said is that this is a known concern, it's being actively addressed, and the mission decision to proceed with crew will reflect NASA's assessment that the risk has been managed to acceptable levels. Whether those acceptable levels feel acceptable from the outside is a different question, and it's the kind of question that hangs over crewed deep space missions in a way that it doesn't hang over robotic ones. Part 18. The cost crisis nobody solves publicly. Here is a number that changes the way you think about everything else in this story. Early independent estimates put the cost of a single space launch system launch at roughly $4 billion or more. That's $4,000 million for one flight. For comparison, the entire Apollo 11 mission, adjusted for modern inflation, costs somewhere in the range of $20 to $30 billion depending on how you account for the broader program costs. And Apollo 11 landed on the moon, planted a flag, collected rocks, and launched back. A single SLS launch at $4 billion doesn't get you anywhere near that. It gets you to deep space as a first step in a multi-launch architecture. The Space Shuttle program, over its lifetime, averaged something in the range of $1.5 billion per flight, and even that cost was widely considered to be a barrier to the affordable access to space that the shuttle had originally been designed to provide. SLS is significantly more expensive than the shuttle per launch, for a vehicle that is still in its early operational flights. To put this in the context of what an actual lunar fuel economy would require, the entire vision of a cislunar propellant depot supplying deep space missions depends on frequent access to the moon, not one landing every few years. Frequent, reliable, affordable access that allows you to build infrastructure incrementally and supply it continuously. At $4 billion per SLS launch, that vision is economically impossible. The math doesn't close. You cannot build an operational lunar fuel economy using a launch architecture that costs more per flight than the annual GDP of small nations. NASA is aware of this. The strategy, stated relatively explicitly in Artemis planning documents, is that SLS and Orion serve as the government-funded backbone for the early phase of lunar operations, while commercial systems, primarily Elon Musk's SpaceX Starship and other next-generation heavy-lift vehicles, provide the high-frequency, lower-cost access that operational infrastructure development requires. Starship in particular is designed for reusability and high flight rates in a way that SLS explicitly is not. If Starship achieves its design goals, the cost per kilogram to lunar orbit could decrease by an order of magnitude or more compared to SLS. But Starship has its own development challenges, its own timeline uncertainties, and its own risk profile. The transition from an SLS-based architecture to a commercially dominated architecture is neither guaranteed nor smoothly defined. There's a gap in the plan where the expensive government rocket is supposed to be replaced by affordable commercial rockets, and that transition has to happen successfully, or the economics of the entire lunar infrastructure vision collapse before the vision becomes operational. Part 19, The Real Plan Beneath the Plan. The surface-level story of Artemis is a government space program building rockets to send humans to the moon. That story is accurate, but it's not the whole architecture. What NASA is actually trying to build across the next decade is a hybrid ecosystem. The government provides the initial capability backbone, the crewed missions, the surface access, the diplomatic framework through the Artemis Accords, and the anchor customer demand that makes commercial investment in cislunar infrastructure viable. Commercial providers then develop the transportation systems, the habitat modules, the in-situ resource utilization technology, and the propellant production capacity that turn the initial government foothold into a sustainable economic ecosystem. The government is the seed customer, the private sector is the scaling mechanism. This model is not new. It's essentially the model that created commercial aviation and commercial satellite communications. The government establishes the initial infrastructure and demand signal, and private investment follows the market that the government created. It worked for GPS. It worked for weather satellites. The question is whether it works for cislunar space infrastructure, where the time horizons are longer, the risks are higher, and the technology is less mature than in any previous case. The Commercial Lunar Lander Program, which NASA calls CLPS for Commercial Lunar Payload Services, is part of this architecture. Commercial companies compete for NASA contracts to deliver payloads to the lunar surface. Some of those payloads are scientific instruments, but some are technology demonstrations for the ISRU capabilities that the long-term resource play depends on. NASA is distributing the development risk across commercial actors while retaining the crewed mission capability as a government program. The dependency on unproven commercial systems is a real structural vulnerability. If the commercial partners that are supposed to provide the high-frequency, affordable access to the Moon face their own developmental setbacks, the transition from the expensive government backbone to the scalable commercial infrastructure doesn't happen on schedule, and delays in that transition delay everything downstream. The propellant depot doesn't get built, the lunar economy doesn't emerge, the geopolitical positioning advantage either isn't achieved or has to be competed for at SLS economics, which is not a competition you can sustain indefinitely. Artemis II, in this context, is proving the government backbone works. That's necessary but not sufficient. The sufficient condition requires the entire hybrid architecture to function, and validating the backbone is step 1. Part 20. The fourth reveal. Here is the core economic truth that everything else depends on, and it is the part of this story that almost never makes it into the headlines, despite being the load-bearing wall underneath the entire structure. The lunar fuel economy only has value if the cost of getting to space comes down significantly, not incrementally, not by a modest percentage that looks good in a budget presentation, significantly. Because all of the strategic positioning, the infrastructure racing, the geopolitical competition over South Pole real estate, the careful diplomatic engineering of the Artemis Accords, the international partnerships, the commercial lunar payload contracts, none of it translates into actual economic benefit unless space access becomes affordable enough that missions happen at a frequency that justifies the infrastructure investment in the first place. And right now, that frequency does not exist. Think about what a cislunar propellant depot actually requires to be economically meaningful. It is not enough to build the facility. It is not enough to demonstrate that the extraction process works, that the electrolysis produces hydrogen and oxygen, that the cryogenic storage holds, that the transfer mechanisms function in the lunar environment. All of that matters enormously, but it is the upstream half of the equation. The downstream half is demand. A cislunar propellant depot that serves 3 missions per decade is not an economic asset. It is an extraordinarily expensive science project, a monument to engineering capability that generates no return, sustains no industry, and justifies no follow-on investment. The infrastructure only becomes valuable when the traffic through it reaches a level where the per-mission cost savings compound into something that changes the fundamental economics of operating in deep space. A depot that serves dozens of missions per year, that becomes a routine waypoint rather than an occasional destination, that is the seed of a genuine space economy. That is the version of the future that makes the entire argument work. And getting from where we are to that version requires solving a problem that is not primarily technical. The technical barrier to lunar water extraction is real. Nobody's pretending otherwise. Operating in permanently shadowed craters at temperatures approaching negative 230 degrees Celsius, excavating material whose properties at scale we have not fully characterized, running electrolysis systems and cryogenic storage in an environment that punishes every design assumption you brought from Earth, managing power systems that have to bridge the gap between sunlit ridges and permanently dark crater floors. These are genuinely hard engineering problems. They will require years of development, iterative testing, robotic precursor missions, and probably a number of expensive failures before anything approaches operational reliability. The technical challenge is formidable, but the technical barrier is potentially solvable. The physics allows it. The chemistry works. The engineering path, however difficult, exists. You can draw a line from where we are today to a functioning lunar ISRU system, and while that line passes through enormous complexity, it does not pass through any fundamental impossibility. Given sufficient time, sufficient investment, and sufficient willingness to iterate through failure, the technical problems yield to engineering. The cost barrier is different in kind. The cost barrier is structural in a way that engineering solutions alone cannot fix. It is not a problem you solve by building a better pump, or developing a more efficient electrolysis membrane, or improving the thermal management of a cryogenic storage tank. It is a problem rooted in the fundamental economics of how we currently access space, and addressing it requires a different kind of vehicle, a different approach to reusability, a different scale of production, and a fundamentally different relationship between government programs and commercial space operations. Here is the specific version of the problem. The Space Launch System, which is the rocket currently at the center of the Artemis architecture, costs somewhere in the range of $4 billion or more per launch by independent estimates. That number is not a minor inconvenience. It is a structural ceiling on everything the program can accomplish. At $4 billion per flight, you cannot build operational lunar infrastructure at the pace or scale required. You cannot fly the number of missions that a functioning propellant economy demands. You cannot create the traffic density that makes a cislunar depot economically self-justifying. At $4 billion per flight, every mission is a political event, a budget crisis, and a public spectacle, which is the opposite of the routine, high-cadence access that an actual space economy requires. And here is the uncomfortable mathematical consequence of that cost structure. If producing propellant on the Moon costs more per kilogram than launching the same propellant from Earth using high-cadence commercial rockets, then the entire ISRU investment produces no net economic benefit. You have built a mining and processing facility on another world at extraordinary expense, operated it at extraordinary ongoing cost, and the output is propellant that is more expensive than the alternative you are trying to replace. That is not a stepping stone to a space economy. That is an expensive way to accomplish nothing new, and it would represent one of the most costly misdirections of national resources in the history of space exploration. This is why the development of truly reusable high-cadence launch systems is not simply a commercial aviation story happening in parallel with the Artemis program. It is not background noise to the main event. It is structurally integral to whether the main event has any lasting meaning. SpaceX's Starship, which is designed from the ground up for rapid reusability and high flight rates, represents the most concrete current attempt to solve this problem. If Starship achieves something close to its design goals, the cost per kilogram to cislunar space could fall by an order of magnitude or more compared to SLS. That cost reduction is not a nice-to-have feature. It is the precondition for everything else making economic sense. Without it, the lunar infrastructure vision remains permanently in the category of things that are theoretically compelling but practically unaffordable at the scale required. Other commercial heavy lift systems are in various stages of development. The competitive pressure that SpaceX has introduced into the launch market has already driven cost reductions that would have seemed implausible a decade ago. The price per kilogram to low Earth orbit has fallen dramatically compared to the shuttle era. That trend, if it continues and extends to cislunar destinations, is the economic foundation that the entire lunar fuel economy argument is built on. Not the extraction technology, not the storage systems, not the depot architecture, the launch cost. That is the variable that determines whether everything else adds up. This is why the development of reusable launch capability is not a separate chapter in the space story. It is the Artemis story. It is the lunar infrastructure story. It is the geopolitical competition story. Because the resource play at the South Pole only produces a strategic advantage if the infrastructure can be built and operated at a cost that makes the propellant economically competitive with Earth-launched alternatives. If that cost threshold is not crossed, the ice in the craters is geologically interesting and strategically irrelevant. The competition for the South Pole real estate becomes a very expensive exercise in territorial logic that produces no downstream economic return. Artemis II validates the human spaceflight system. That validation is necessary and meaningful, proving that people can leave Earth orbit, survive the journey, and return safely is the essential first step in every version of the future being discussed. But validating the crewed system only matters if the downstream economic architecture that it is supposed to enable actually materializes on a timeline and at a cost structure that closes the equation, and that requires solving the cost problem that SLS, by deliberate design choice, does not solve and was never intended to solve. SLS exists to prove the capability. The commercial systems that follow are supposed to make that capability economically viable. The transition between those two phases is not guaranteed, not fully defined, and not on a schedule that anyone can state with high confidence. That gap between the capability Artemis II proves and the economic architecture that capability is supposed to unlock is where the entire vision either succeeds or quietly fails. Not in a dramatic explosion, not in a cancelled mission, but in the slow accumulation of cost overruns, schedule slips, and commercial development delays that gradually transform an ambitious infrastructure strategy into another chapter in the long history of space programs that almost became something permanent. The ice is there, the physics works, the economics might work, and whether they do depends on decisions being made right now, in boardrooms and budget offices and rocket test facilities, by people who understand that the moon mission and the cost revolution are not two separate stories. They are the same story, and one cannot succeed without the other. Part 21. Why we didn't go back for 50 years. The 50-year gap in human deep space exploration didn't happen because the moon stopped being interesting. It didn't happen because we ran out of rockets, or because the engineers lost their nerve, or because some catastrophic failure made the whole enterprise seem impossible. It happened because the political structure that created Apollo was fundamentally unsustainable, and when it collapsed, nobody replaced it with anything comparably durable. And understanding why that structure collapsed is essential to understanding why Artemis II carries the specific kind of weight that it does, because the same forces that destroyed Apollo are the forces that Artemis is explicitly trying to immunize itself against. Apollo was not a science program that happened to be ambitious. It was a crisis response that happened to do science. The distinction matters enormously. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in October 1957, the psychological impact in the United States was not merely surprise. It was something closer to institutional panic. A beach ball-sized metal sphere beeping from orbit had demonstrated, in the most public and undeniable way possible, that American technological supremacy was not the guaranteed condition that the post-war decade had suggested it was. Then in April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being in space, and the panic deepened. The Soviets were not just ahead in satellites, they were ahead in the capability that mattered most, putting human beings beyond the atmosphere of Earth. The political trauma of that sequence produced a response that, in retrospect, looks almost irrational in its scale and speed. President Kennedy stood before Congress in May 1961, less than 3 weeks after Gagarin's flight, and committed the United States to landing a human on the moon before the end of the decade. Not because the technology to do it existed, it didn't. Not because there was a clear plan for how to accomplish it, there wasn't. But because the geopolitical cost of losing the next phase of the space race, of allowing the Soviet Union to plant its flag on the moon first, was judged to be so severe that the commitment had to be made before the capability existed to back it up. The goal created the program. The crisis created the goal. At its peak, NASA's budget consumed roughly 4.5% of total federal spending annually. To put that in perspective that actually lands, the entire current NASA budget is less than half of 1% of federal spending. That peak Apollo-era commitment, if applied today at the same proportion of federal spending, would represent a NASA budget of something in the range of $250 to $300 billion per year. The actual current budget is around $25 billion. The workforce across NASA centers and the network of contractors and subcontractors that built the Saturn V and the Apollo spacecraft numbered in the hundreds of thousands of people. Entire industrial ecosystems existed for the sole purpose of solving the specific engineering problems that stood between the United States and a lunar landing. It was, in the most precise sense of the phrase, an industrial mobilization. The same phrase used for what happens when a nation converts its manufacturing capacity to wartime production. Apollo was not peacetime science. It was the economic and industrial equivalent of a war effort aimed at a single, specific, time-bounded objective: win the race, get there first. Do not allow the Soviet Union to establish the psychological and geopolitical dominance that a moon landing before America's would have conferred. And then Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface in July 1969, and the crisis logic that had sustained the entire commitment began dissolving almost immediately, not overnight, not in a single budget cycle, but with an inevitability that, in hindsight, was probably always built into the structure of what Apollo actually was. A crisis response ends when the crisis is perceived to be resolved. The race was won. The goal Kennedy had set was achieved. The Soviet lunar program, which had been running in parallel and which had its own serious crewed lunar ambitions, collapsed under its own internal pressures around the same period. The existential competitive threat that had justified Apollo-scale spending simply ceased to present itself with the same urgency. There was no second goal. That's the core of it. After the moon landing, NASA proposed ambitious follow-on programs: a permanent lunar base, a crewed Mars mission by the 1980s, a space station in Earth orbit as a waypoint for deeper exploration. Some of these proposals were technically coherent and genuinely exciting. None of them carried the same geopolitical urgency that had made Apollo politically unfightable. Without that urgency, they were just expensive ideas competing against other expensive ideas in a budget process that had many other priorities. They lost, as expensive ideas without crisis backing tend to lose. The last 3 Apollo missions scheduled after Apollo 17, missions 18, 19 and 20, were cancelled. Not because they would have failed, not because the hardware wasn't being built, because the political appetite for the cost had evaporated and the geopolitical justification for maintaining it had gone with the crisis that created it. The Saturn V production line shut down. The specialised manufacturing facilities closed or converted to other purposes. The engineers who had spent years solving problems that had never been solved before moved to other programs, other industries, other careers. The institutional knowledge didn't vanish on a specific date. It dispersed slowly across decades, thinning out as the people who carried it retired or died, until what remained was a collection of documents and drawings that described what had been done without fully capturing how or why the thousands of specific decisions that made it work had been made. The space shuttle era that followed was not a continuation of Apollo's ambitions. It was a retreat to a more politically defensible position. Low Earth orbit, reusable systems, reduced cost in theory, a space station eventually. The shuttle flew for 30 years and accomplished genuinely remarkable things, including constructing the International Space Station, which itself became a model of the kind of politically durable, internationally entangled program that Artemis is now trying to replicate. But it did so by abandoning the deep space capability that Apollo had built. For 3 decades, human spaceflight meant going up a few hundred kilometers and coming back down. The moon might as well have been on the other side of the universe for all the practical difference it made to the operational reality of the program. And for 50 years, no comparable geopolitical pressure materialized to restart the deep space engine. Not because the moon became less valuable, not because the arguments for a permanent lunar presence became less compelling, but because the specific combination of conditions that had created Apollo, a credible near-peer competitor demonstrating capability in real time, a clear and time-bounded goal that could be won or lost, and a political leadership willing to make an extraordinary resource commitment to avoid losing. That combination did not reassemble itself for half a century. It is reassembling now. Not identically. Not with the same Cold War intensity or the same binary ideological framing. The current competition is more economically inflected, more focused on infrastructure and resources than on symbolic firsts, and more distributed across commercial actors alongside national programs. But the structural similarity is genuinely hard to ignore when you look at it clearly. A competing power is making credible, systematic and well-funded progress toward establishing a lunar presence. It is targeting the same geographic region that the American program is targeting. It is operating under a different governance framework with different rules about resource rights and international cooperation. And it is doing so on a timeline that creates real urgency, not theoretical urgency, around the American program's ability to establish a prior presence at the locations that matter most. The urgency is real, even if it is not being expressed with the same public drama as Sputnik. There are no breathless news broadcasts announcing that China has reached the lunar South Pole ahead of schedule. The competitive pressure is quieter, more bureaucratic, more embedded in technical briefings and policy documents than in headlines. But the underlying logic is the same. The window for establishing a first-mover position at the most strategically valuable location in cislunar space is not indefinitely open. And the program that is supposed to get America there is flying its first crewed mission right now, 50 years after the last time anyone tried. Artemis is the response to a pressure that took 50 years to rebuild to the level that could generate a response. Whether it is a response at sufficient scale, with sufficient political durability and sufficient insulation from the forces that destroyed Apollo, is the question that Artemis II is the very first data point in answering. One mission, one crew, 10 days, and the beginning of an answer to whether this time we actually mean it. Part 22, The Pattern of Failure. American space history after Apollo has a recurring shape that is uncomfortable to look at directly. Not because it is dramatic or scandalous, but because it is mundane in the specific way that institutional failure tends to be mundane. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a single catastrophic decision or a villain making a speech about cutting the budget. It accumulates quietly through the ordinary friction of political transitions and competing priorities and cost overruns that nobody planned for and schedule slips that nobody admits are structural rather than temporary. And then one day you look up and realize that another decade has passed and another program has dissolved, and we are somehow still not back on the moon. The pattern has repeated enough times that it deserves to be named clearly, because understanding it is essential to understanding what Artemis II is actually trying to prove, and why the proof it needs to deliver goes beyond anything that can be measured by instruments or captured in post-mission technical reports. A program gets announced with significant ambition. The announcement comes with political capital behind it, usually tied to an administration that wants a legacy, a geopolitical moment that demands a response, or both. Funding flows in, engineers get hired, contracts get awarded. Development begins on hardware that is genuinely complex and genuinely difficult to build on any timeline, let alone the optimistic one that appeared in the original announcement. Years pass. The complexity reveals itself in cost growth. The cost growth produces schedule slips. The schedule slips produce budget renegotiations. The budget renegotiations produce descoped requirements. The descoped requirements produce a program that is gradually becoming something different from what was originally announced, which is fine as long as the political will to see it through survives the transition. Then an administration changes, and the new administration, which did not make the original commitment and does not share the original political investment in the program's success, looks at what it has inherited. It sees a program that is over budget, behind schedule, and producing hardware that hasn't yet flown. It sees an opportunity to announce its own vision, its own priorities, its own version of what space exploration should look like. And it makes a decision that is individually rational, from a short-term political perspective, even as it is collectively catastrophic from a long-term programmatic one. It cancels what it inherited and starts something new. The Constellation program is the most recent and cleanest example of this cycle, and it is worth spending some time with because the details are instructive in ways that go beyond simple budget history. Constellation was announced in 2004 under the George W. Bush administration as the vision for space exploration. The goal was explicit and time-bounded. Return humans to the moon by 2020. Develop a crew exploration vehicle called Orion. Build a new heavy-lift rocket called Ares, 5 capable of sending that vehicle, and a lunar lander to the moon. It was, in its ambition and its specific lunar focus, the closest thing to an Apollo successor that had been proposed since Apollo ended. The program spent 6 years in development. Billions of dollars were committed. The Orion capsule design matured significantly. The Ares rockets progressed through design phases. A genuine workforce was assembled and began doing genuine work. And then in 2010, the Obama administration conducted a review of NASA's human spaceflight programs and concluded that Constellation was over budget, behind schedule, and unlikely to achieve its goals within any realistic funding projection. The program was cancelled, not paused, not restructured into something with more modest near-term goals. Cancelled with the explicit intent of redirecting NASA toward commercial crew development for low Earth orbit and a longer-term deep space strategy that was deliberately left less specific. The cancellation was not irrational from the perspective of the administration that made it. The independent review panel that assessed Constellation, the Augustine Commission, had concluded essentially the same thing. The program was not executable as designed within its budget. Continuing it would have meant either dramatic additional funding that Congress was unlikely to approve or dramatic additional schedule extensions that would have pushed the lunar return well past 2020 regardless. The decision to cancel was defensible on the merits. But here is what the cancellation actually produced. The hardware development that had been done, the engineering progress on Orion, the work on shuttle-derived heavy lift concepts, the workforce that had been assembled, it didn't disappear. It went into a kind of holding pattern, partly mothballed, partly redirected, and eventually partly reconstituted into the successor program that eventually became the Space Launch System and the modern Artemis architecture. The SLS rocket uses main engines derived from the Space Shuttle. Its core stage design draws heavily on shuttle-era manufacturing and production knowledge. The Orion capsule is a direct continuation of the Constellation-era Orion development. In some cases, literally the same hardware components that were being built for Constellation ended up in the Artemis stack, which means that somewhere between 6 and 10 years of development time and billions of dollars of investment were essentially spent going in a circle. Not a complete circle. Progress was made, knowledge was accumulated, but the institutional disruption of cancellation and restart, the workforce dispersal, the contractor relationship rebuilding, the requirements rebaselining, these consumed time and money that would have been entirely unnecessary if the program had simply been allowed to continue evolving rather than being killed and reborn under a different name. The Space Shuttle program, which occupied the 3 decades between Apollo and the beginning of the Constellation Artemis era, is a different kind of cautionary tale, but one that connects to the same underlying problem. The shuttle was operationally impressive in ways that deserve genuine acknowledgement. It carried more payload to orbit than any vehicle of its era. It serviced the Hubble Space Telescope in ways that extended that instrument's life and scientific output by decades. It assembled the International Space Station, which is an engineering achievement that required an extraordinary number of complex orbital construction operations, performed successfully over more than a decade. These are real accomplishments and they should not be dismissed. But the shuttle's design choices came with a cost that compounded over 30 years. The vehicle was designed for low Earth orbit, and it locked the entire human spaceflight program into low Earth orbit for its entire operational life. The original vision for the shuttle program included flight rates of dozens of missions per year, which would have driven down per-mission costs to levels that might have made it genuinely transformative for space access economics. It never came close to that rate. 135 missions over 30 years averages out to fewer than 5 per year. The economics that were supposed to improve never improved. The cost per flight remained high enough that every mission was a significant budget event rather than routine operations. And while the shuttle and the ISS it built are achievements, the ISS became, in a specific programmatic sense, a destination that substituted for ambition rather than enabling it. Low Earth orbit stopped being a waypoint and became the endpoint. For 30 years, human spaceflight meant going to orbit, working in orbit, and coming back from orbit. The Moon was a memory. Mars was a speech topic. The deep space capability that Apollo had demonstrated eroded almost completely because no operational program maintained it. Artemis is attempting to break this loop. Not by being more technically ambitious than previous programs, though it is that, and not by being better engineered, though it aims to be, but by being more structurally resilient against the specific political and institutional forces that have killed every previous attempt. The strategies it is using are explicitly drawn from the lessons of what went wrong before. International partnerships create diplomatic costs to cancellation that purely domestic programs don't carry. When the European Space Agency is providing the service module that keeps Orion's crew alive, when Canada has an astronaut on the crew and a robotic arm on the vehicle, when Japan and Australia and more than 40 other nations have formally aligned their lunar programs with the American framework through the Artemis Accords, cancelling the American program is no longer a purely domestic budget decision. It is a diplomatic event with consequences that extend into relationships that matter far beyond space policy. That entanglement is a feature. It was designed in deliberately by people who understood exactly what had happened to Constellation and every program before it. The distributed domestic industrial base serves the same function internally. SLS components are manufactured across multiple states and multiple congressional districts. That geographic distribution creates a political constituency for the program's continuation that transcends any individual administration's preferences. Senators and representatives who might otherwise be indifferent to lunar infrastructure strategy have aerospace employers in their districts whose continued operation depends on Artemis contracts. That dependency doesn't guarantee survival, but it raises the political cost of cancellation in ways that matter in the specific environment where these decisions get made. Whether any of this is sufficient is genuinely unknown. Political engineering of this kind has limits. Sufficiently determined administrations with sufficiently compelling alternative priorities can absorb diplomatic costs and congressional resistance when they judge the alternative to be worse. The history of cancelled programs is partly a history of exactly those calculations being made. What changes the calculation most reliably is momentum. A program that is flying, that is producing results, that is delivering on the promises that justified the investment, is significantly harder to cancel than a program that exists only in development. Every mission that happens makes the next mission more politically defensible. Every successful flight raises the cost of walking away from what has already been built. Artemis II is the moment the program stops being a development effort and becomes an operational demonstration. That transition from something that exists on paper and in test facilities to something that has put human beings in deep space and brought them home is the single most important political event in the program's history, more important than any budget agreement, more important than any international partnership signing ceremony, because it makes the program real in a way that nothing else can, and real programs are harder to kill than promising ones. The loop has broken programs that looked more robust than Artemis does right now. Whether this one is different is a question that Artemis II begins to answer the moment it leaves the launch pad. Part 23. The too big to cancel strategy. There is a principle in large-scale government programs that political scientists and program managers both understand, even if they tend to describe it in different language and from different levels of abstraction. The principle is this: a program becomes very difficult to cancel when enough stakeholders have invested enough in its continuation that the cost of cancellation exceeds the cost of persistence. Not the financial cost alone, though that matters. The total cost: diplomatic, political, economic, reputational, institutional. When that total cost of stopping exceeds the total cost of continuing, the program develops a kind of institutional gravity that makes it resistant to the normal forces that have killed every previous American lunar initiative. This is not an accident of history or a lucky byproduct of good program management. It is deliberate design strategy applied to Artemis with a sophistication and intentionality that distinguishes it from every previous attempt to return humans to deep space. The people who architected the Artemis program understood the history. They understood why Constellation failed. They understood why the programs before Constellation failed. They understood that technical excellence and scientific merit and even genuine public enthusiasm are not sufficient to protect a long-duration space program from the ordinary political forces that operate on much shorter timescales than the engineering requires. And so they built a program that is not just technically ambitious, but politically engineered to survive in an environment that has proven lethal to its predecessors. To understand how thoroughly this principle has been applied, it helps to look at the international dimension first, because it is the most visible layer of the architecture and the one that carries the most immediate diplomatic weight. The Canadian Space Agency provided the Canadarm3 robotic system for the Orion spacecraft and the Gateway lunar station. Canada also has an astronaut, Jeremy Hansen, assigned to the Artemis II crew, making him the first Canadian and the first non-American to fly on a deep space mission. This is not a token gesture of international goodwill. It is a structural dependency. The robotic arm that Canada developed is a functional component of the mission architecture, not an optional enhancement. And placing a Canadian crew member on the first crewed deep space mission in 50 years creates a bilateral relationship that carries weight entirely disproportionate to the technical contribution involved. Cancelling Artemis after a Canadian astronaut has trained for years, after Canada has invested its National Space Agency resources and its political prestige in the partnership, is not simply a NASA budget decision. It is a diplomatic event involving a close ally on a matter of national significance to that ally. The European Space Agency provides the service module for the Orion capsule. This is not a peripheral component. The service module generates the electrical power that keeps the crew alive. It provides the main propulsion for orbital maneuvers. It manages the thermal environment that prevents the spacecraft from freezing or overheating. It is, in the most literal sense, the part of the spacecraft that sustains the mission between launch and re-entry. ESA has invested years of engineering development and hundreds of millions of euros in this contribution. The member states of ESA, which include most of Western Europe, have a direct material stake in the programme's continuation. Cancelling Artemis means writing off that investment, breaking the partnership agreements that govern the contribution, and absorbing the diplomatic consequences across relationships that extend into trade, defence, intelligence sharing, and a dozen other domains where European cooperation matters to American interests. JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, is developing lunar surface mobility systems and has committed to contributing astronauts to future Artemis missions. The Australian Space Agency is contributing Earth observation and communication assets. The United Kingdom, Italy, the United Arab Emirates, Brazil, and more than 40 nations in total have signed the Artemis Accords, the bilateral framework that establishes the operating principles for American-aligned lunar activity. Each signature represents a government that has made a political commitment, allocated at least some national resources, and begun aligning its own space program activities with the American framework. Each additional signatory makes the framework more legitimate, more embedded, and more costly to walk away from. The domestic industrial dimension operates on the same logic, but through a different political mechanism. The space launch system is not manufactured in a single facility in a single state. Its components are distributed across the country in a pattern that is not accidental. The core stage is assembled at the Michoud Assembly Facility in Louisiana, the same facility that built the Saturn V stages and the Space Shuttle external tanks. The solid rocket boosters involve manufacturing in Utah. The RS-25 engines have production relationships in California. Avionics and systems integration work is spread across Alabama, Florida, Texas, and elsewhere. The pattern looks like geography. It functions like politics. Every facility that builds SLS components represents jobs in a congressional district. Every job represents a constituent. Every constituent represents a vote, and more practically a reason for a senator or representative to think twice before supporting a budget amendment that cancels the contracts that employ them. The political logic that protects Artemis in Congress is not primarily philosophical. Most senators and representatives are not deeply engaged with the strategic arguments about lunar water ice and cislunar propellant economics and first-mover advantages in the deep space supply chain. They are engaged with the employment numbers at the aerospace facilities in their states. That engagement is reliable in a way that philosophical commitment to space exploration simply is not, because it connects to the most durable of all political motivations, the protection of constituent economic interests. The International Space Station offers the most instructive historical parallel for understanding how this architecture works in practice over long time horizons. The ISS faced serious budget threats multiple times during its construction and operational phases. There were genuine moments when cancellation appeared possible, when the cost overruns and schedule delays and political skepticism aligned in ways that could have ended the program. What protected it, repeatedly, was exactly the combination of international entanglement and domestic distribution that made cancellation more expensive than continuation. Russia was a partner, Japan was a partner, Canada and the European agencies were partners. Cancelling the ISS meant cancelling those relationships, absorbing those diplomatic costs, and explaining to Allied governments why the United States was walking away from commitments it had made at the highest levels. The political cost of that explanation consistently exceeded the political cost of continuing to fund a program that was over budget and behind schedule. Artemis is being built with that same immunization logic installed from the beginning, rather than allowing it to develop organically over time the way the ISS partnership structures did. This is a meaningful distinction. The ISS became hard to cancel gradually, as the international relationships deepened and the domestic industrial base embedded itself over years of construction. Artemis was designed to be hard to cancel by architecture, with the partnership structures and the industrial distribution built into the program from its early phases rather than accumulated as a byproduct of operational history. The people who made those design choices understood the history and drew the correct lesson from it. The Artemis Accords expansion operates as a network effect that compounds over time in a way that is worth understanding clearly. When a nation signs the Accords and begins aligning its lunar program with the American framework, it gains access to the cooperation, data sharing, and interoperability that the framework provides. That access makes the American-led architecture more useful to the signatory, which deepens the alignment, which makes it harder to exit, which attracts other nations who want access to the same framework, which deepens the legitimacy of the whole system. The goal, stated simply, is to make the American-led cislunar architecture the default architecture before any competing framework has time to establish comparable depth of commitment and comparable network depth. It is the same logic that governs technology platform competition. The platform that achieves sufficient adoption first tends to become self-reinforcing because the cost of switching to an alternative rises with every additional participant who has built their operations around the existing platform. All of this political and diplomatic and industrial engineering means that Artemis II is carrying weight that goes far beyond its technical mission objectives. It is the activation event for the entire system. Everything described above, the international partnerships, the bilateral agreements, the industrial distribution, the Accords framework, exists as potential energy until the program demonstrates that it can actually deliver what it promised. Potential energy is not the same as kinetic energy. Partnerships that exist on paper and in agreements are not the same as partnerships that have watched their astronauts fly and their hardware perform. Congressional constituencies that depend on aerospace employment are not the same as congressional constituencies that have watched their state's contribution help send humans to deep space. Successful crewed deep space flight transforms the political engineering from architecture into reality. It gives international partners proof that their investment produced a result. It gives Congress a tangible, visible, undeniable return on the resources committed. It gives commercial partners the confidence that the anchor customer they have been building toward is real and operational, rather than theoretical and perpetually deferred. It gives the program the most powerful political protection that that any space program can have, the protection of momentum, of having already happened, of being the kind of thing that is easier to continue than to explain why you stopped. Every subsequent mission becomes easier to defend politically because the first crewed mission has already occurred. That is not a small thing. In the specific political environment where American space programs live and die, the difference between a program that has flown and a program that hasn't is the difference between an achievement and a promise. Promises get cancelled. Achievements get built upon. Artemis II is the moment the promise becomes an achievement. The people who designed the program to reach this moment, who built the international dependencies and the industrial distribution and the Accords framework specifically to make this moment as politically irreversible as possible, understood exactly what they were doing. Whether it works is still an open question. But the sophistication of the attempt is not in doubt. This is not a program that stumbled into political durability. It is a program that was engineered for it, deliberately, by people who had watched every previous attempt fail and were determined to build something that the normal forces of political entropy could not easily destroy. The question is whether the engineering was good enough, and Artemis II is where we begin to find out. Part 24, What Happens If It Works. Let's spend some time with the scenario that the people who've dedicated their careers to this actually believe in. The scenario where everything goes approximately right. Artemis II succeeds. 4 people fly to the moon, circle it, and come home safely. The system is validated. Public confidence rises. Congressional opposition weakens. Partner nations deepen their commitments. Commercial investment in cislunar infrastructure accelerates because the anchor customer has proven it's real. The next missions follow, and Artemis III lands at the lunar South Pole. Crew members walk on the surface near permanently shadowed craters and collect samples that confirm the distribution and concentration of water ice at accessible depths. The data comes back. It's good. It's better than the conservative estimates. Small-scale ISRU demonstrations begin. A robotic system extracts a few litres of water from the lunar soil and electrolyzes it, producing measurable quantities of hydrogen and oxygen. The demonstration is modest, but it closes the loop. It proves the process works in the actual lunar environment with actual lunar ice. Investment follows. Commercial companies begin building larger systems. A second generation of NASA and commercial missions constructs a preliminary propellant production facility at the optimal location near the South Pole. By the early 2030s, a cislunar propellant depot is operational, not at full scale, not yet supplying all deep space missions, but functioning, taking in ice, producing propellant, storing it. The first mission that uses depot-produced propellant for part of its journey marks a threshold. The economics of that mission are different from every mission that came before it. Not dramatically yet, but the trend line is established. The downstream effects begin to compound. Mars mission planning changes. Instead of requiring enormous Earth-launched propellant loads, mission architects start designing around lunar propellant availability. The mission architectures become lighter. The launch requirements from Earth become smaller. More missions become economically viable. The Earth-Moon system begins to function as an integrated economy in a way that no solar system mission previously had to plan around. The permanent lunar presence that follows becomes the template for something even further out. The lessons of ISRU on the Moon, the operational experience of sustained human presence beyond Earth orbit, the institutional knowledge that doesn't get to dissolve this time because the infrastructure is too embedded to walk away from, these become the foundation for Mars. Not in a vague, inspirational way, in a logistical supply chain, economics of propellant way. The Moon becomes the proof of concept for living somewhere other than Earth. None of this is science fiction. Every element described has physics behind it, engineering roadmaps behind it, and economic logic behind it. What doesn't yet exist is the proof that the system can be built, maintained, and operated at scale in the actual environment of deep space. That's what Artemis II begins to provide, and the consequences of providing it, if the program holds together long enough to deliver, are not modest. They are civilizational in scope, in the specific sense that they determine whether and how humanity expands beyond the world it came from. Part 25. Final Reveal/Ending. Here is what I want you to take away from everything we've covered. We started with a mission that was being described as a science mission, an exploration mission, a step toward Mars, an inspirational human achievement, and it is all of those things. But underneath those descriptions is a structure of logic that is more specific, more urgent, and more consequential than any of those framings fully captures. Artemis II is the first attempt in over 50 years to prove that human beings can leave Earth orbit and come home safely using modern systems. It is also the essential first validation step for a strategy that is fundamentally about resources, logistics, and economic positioning in a competitive geopolitical environment where the rules haven't been written yet and where physical presence may end up functioning as territory in all the ways that matter. It is a test flight. It is a proof of concept. It is a geopolitical move. It is a bet on a technological future that has compelling logic but no guaranteed outcome. It is all of these simultaneously, and the extraordinary thing about it is how little of that complexity makes it into the public conversation. Science versus infrastructure versus geopolitics is a false choice. These aren't competing interpretations of what the mission is about. They're layers of the same thing. The science is real. The exploration is real. The inspiration is real. And underneath all of it is the structural logic of a civilization that is, for the first time, beginning to think about operating outside the planet it evolved on, not as a fantasy, not as a thought experiment, but as a logistical challenge to be engineered and resourced and competed over in the same way that every previous frontier has been engineered and resourced and competed over. The outcome is genuinely uncertain. Artemis II might fly perfectly and unlock everything. It might encounter a problem that sets the program back. The political will might not last the full arc. The commercial architecture might not develop at the required pace. China might get to the South Pole first and establish a presence that changes the terms of what comes after. The history of space programs is not a history of smooth trajectories. It's a history of near misses, surprising successes, political cancellations, and occasional moments when something genuinely extraordinary happens against the odds. What's extraordinary about this particular moment is that humanity is, for the first time, attempting to do in space what it has done on Earth throughout its entire history. Locate a resource, understand its strategic value, build the infrastructure to access it, and compete for the position that controls it. That's not exploration. That's civilization. The moon will still be there regardless of what happens. It will still reflect sunlight onto every ocean and every field and every city on Earth, the way it has for 4.5 billion years. But our ability to use it, to turn the ice in its shadowed craters into the fuel that extends our reach into the solar system, that is not guaranteed. It depends on missions that work, on programs that survive, on political will that outlasts election cycles, on engineers who solve problems that haven't been solved before under conditions that have never been tested at scale. Artemis II doesn't resolve any of that uncertainty. What it does is move humanity one step closer to the moment when we find out which version of the future we actually get. And there is something worth paying attention to in the fact that for the first time in over 50 years, that moment is close enough to be scheduled on a calendar. The question now is whether we're ready for what it means if it actually works.